Good afternoon. I'm Leela Gandhi, Director of the Pembroke Center, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to our annual flagship Pembroke Publics Lecture. The Pembroke Publics series brings to Brown scholars, artists, activists whose work engages issues of gender and sexuality in a transformative manner, and so doing is characterized by breakthrough creativity, setting a new standard in thought, life, art. There is no one better to deliver this year's lecture than Dorothy Roberts. Professor Dorothy Roberts is an internationally acclaimed scholar, public intellectual, and social justice advocate. She has written and lectured extensively on race, gender, and class inequities in US institutions and has been a leader in changing public thinking and policy on reproductive freedom, child welfare, and bioethics. She is the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor and George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, with joint appointments in the departments of Africana Studies and Sociology in the Law School. Professor Roberts is also founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society. Her major publications include Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, 2011, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, 2002, and Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, 1997. She is author of more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters and co-editor of at least 6 books on constitutional law and women and the law. Publishers Weekly called her most recent book, Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World, illuminating and alarming. It sort of captures it all, really. Ibram X. Kendi described this book as mind-blowing, a devastating indictment of the child welfare system. Professor Roberts's work has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, National Science Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Harvard Program on Ethics and the Professions, Stanford Center for the Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. Her many accolades, recognitions of scholarship and public service include a 2019 Rutgers University Newark Honorary Doctor of Laws degree, a 2017 election to the National Academy of Medicine, a 2016 Society of Planning Lifetime Achievement Award, the prestigious 2016 Tanner Lectures on Human Values, the 2015 American Psychiatric Association Solomon Carter Fuller Award. I am absolutely humbled and honored and delighted to welcome you, Professor Dorothy Roberts, to the Pembroke Center today.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for all of you coming out, and I feel a close affinity with Brown. I've visited the campus a number of times and always had such a warm welcome, and I'm so happy to see so many students here today. Thanks so much for the invitation. And thanks to Diane Straker, is she around also, for all that she did, there you are, right ahead in front of me, to help arrange this visit, and everyone involved in the invitation. I'm so grateful. Thank you. So I am going to talk about all of reproductive justice and why it's important for us to acknowledge, recognize, and implement in our politics and our thinking, our activism, all that reproductive justice encompasses. And so when we think about reproductive justice, of course, one of the first things that comes to mind is the Dobbs decision and its really horrific incursion on reproductive freedom. I don't know if you've read the decision, but it is mind-boggling at how dismissive the court is, the majority justices are, of reproductive freedom and the impact that compelling people to give birth will have on their lives. Of course, the court, as you know, overturned Roe v. Wade, held that there was no foundation for the right to abortion in the US Constitution. Terrible enough, but the way in which the justices didn't even pay any attention to what the impact would be on people's lives is really galling. In the end, the court says that all that's required, because there's no fundamental right to abortion, although the reasoning would extend beyond abortion to not only reproductive freedom, but many freedoms, freedom of marriage, freedom to parent children, many freedoms that Justice Thomas listed as probably not being covered by the 14th Amendment. But so the court in the end says, all you need is a rational basis. All states need is a rational basis, which of course is the lowest level of judicial scrutiny. And then the court didn't even consider what might be a counter to that rational basis. It just says the state's interest in fetal life is enough, and that's that. And so it's a really disturbing decision that has now divided the nation into about half of states that have laws or will soon pass laws that either ban abortion altogether or so severely restrict it, it's effectively banned, with few exceptions, which effectively don't mean anything, or no exceptions at all. So even the life of the pregnant person doesn't matter in some states. And we've already seen how this law is endangering the lives of pregnant women who have, even if they had intended to have a baby, now have doctors afraid to treat them for fear that they'll be subject to criminal prosecution for saving the life of their patient. And so states divided into these forced birth states and free states. Of course, very reminiscent of the post-Civil War era in the United States. Now, that abominable, even deadly impact of Dobbs on health and freedom of people seeking abortion is profound, and of course, we should be alarmed and be fighting against it in every way that we can. And that's been the major news lately about reproductive justice. But I want to point out another set of cases that you may have noticed making even national news. Very recently, in fact, as recently as a couple weeks ago, and still in the news today. One is the case of the Denier Mercado family who were driving along a highway in Florida when they were pulled over by the Manatee County Sheriff's Department. Armed officers from the Sheriff's Department pulled them over and demanded that they turn over their newborn baby. Now, we know exactly what happened because Tyrone Denier, the father, live streamed this on Instagram. And it got a fair amount of attention because Saisha Mercado, the mother, was a finalist on American Idol. And so people knew about it. So it got more attention than many of the cases like this have gotten. And the reason why the sheriff pulled them over and demanded the baby was because the family had become entangled in Child Protective Services when Ms. Mercado, when she was pregnant with this baby, went to a hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, because her toddler was having trouble transitioning from breastfeeding to solid foods, and she was concerned about his health. And instead of simply helping her to care for the toddler, the staff at the hospital called the child abuse hotline and reported the baby for failing to thrive. They had to leave the hospital without their baby. The hospital took custody of the baby and put the baby eventually in, a toddler, I should say, in foster care. But now the family is on the radar of Child Protective Services, and a judge issues a pickup order to seize their newborn. It's a really heart-wrenching video, if you watch it, with Ms. Mercado pleading with these caseworkers. You can see them up there waiting to take her baby and put the baby in foster care. And she's crying, my baby's healthy, I haven't hurt my baby, why are you taking her? How are you gonna feed her? She's breastfeeding, why are you doing this? They don't care, they take the baby. Now, I think partly because of the publicity around the case and they were able to get good lawyers, they got their baby back after 10 days, though, in foster care. What good did it do for this baby to have endured that trauma? Now, then in February, just a couple months ago, in the news, was the Clybourne and Williams family, a family traveling from Georgia to Chicago to go to a relative's funeral. And the police in a city in Tennessee stopped the car on grounds that its windows were tinted too dark, and I can't remember exactly, it moved into a lane of traffic without a turn signal or something minor like that. But when they searched the car, they found 5 grams of marijuana. If I have the right amount. That's a little amount, right? Does anybody know? It was a little amount. He wasn't even charged with distribution or anything. It was obvious possession for personal use. But they arrested him, and when the family showed up for the court date, now mind you, they're not even from Tennessee. They were on their way to Chicago. When the family shows up for the court date, the police come and seize their 5 children from the courthouse and put them in foster care. I believe they are still fighting to get their children back from foster care. Then just a couple weeks ago, we learned about the Jackson family in a town close to Dallas. They had a home birth, and when they took the baby to the doctor, their pediatrician, they had 2 older children, the doctor said that the baby had jaundice and they should check the baby into the hospital. Now, they were being cared for by a midwife and a doula, and they wanted the midwife to administer the treatment for jaundice in their home. Doctor calls CPS and alleges that this is medical neglect. The police come, they arrest the husband, take his keys, use it to open the door, and take their newborn baby to be put in foster care. Now, I think these cases should be in the news. We should be alarmed by it, and we should also see them as violations of reproductive justice. And it's still the case, I think, despite organizing around reproductive justice for decades, that most people do not understand what happened to these families as being violations of reproductive justice or having anything to do with reproductive justice. So I want to use these two bookends, the legal right to abortion and the invasion into homes by Child Protective Services, I'm going to say more about it, as aspects of reproductive justice. And I today want to talk about why it's important to see the full scope of reproductive justice and to see the way in which these violations and the movements to end them intersect, and why we should see them as a joint, a collective movement for reproductive justice and for building a more caring, humane, and loving world. So I think to understand the full scope of the Dobbs decision's devaluation of reproductive justice, we have to look beyond abortion and consider the entanglement of abortion bans, criminalization of pregnancy, and the state separation of families. And because my work over the last 3 decades has centered on the reproductive violence against Black mothers in particular, I've been acutely aware of the way in which the Dobbs decision brings up an intersectional politics around these various aspects of reproductive justice that have always existed, but in fact, as I'll say soon, have existed since the time of slavery in the United States, but they've been intensified by the Dobbs decision. And so I'm hopeful that people will see how these aspects of our reproductive freedom are inextricably intertwined, because the Dobbs decision intertwines them. And so by recognizing that, I think more and more people will see these connections. There's a long history of punishing Black women for having children, including mass sterilization abuse, pregnancy-related prosecutions, harsh welfare policies, and state child removal. And Roe versus Wade was a victory for the legal right to abortion, but it was a very narrow victory, a very narrow protection against state laws criminalizing abortion, and failed to recognize these other aspects of reproductive freedom, the full scope of reproductive freedom. So leaving in place, without very much judicial or legally recognized protection against these other forms of reproductive violence. And also, for most of its history, the mainstream reproductive rights movement has centered on advocacy for safeguarding the constitutional right to abortion and hasn't paid sufficient attention to these other aspects of reproductive freedom. So, let me move on. So, Black women in particular, but also other women of color and indigenous women began, but based on decades and I would say centuries of resistance, began to develop a reproductive justice framework that challenged the dominant framework of choice. And it was important to center the experiences and leadership of these women, and also to place reproductive freedom and rights in the context of broader struggles for justice, for racial justice, gender justice, class, economic justice, disability justice. So from the very beginning, if you go back and read the first statements of reproductive justice, you will see that it always has included the right both not to have children and to have children, and also the right to parent children in safe, supportive, and sustainable communities. So the reproductive justice framework has always included a concern about what the ways in which our society, including the state, interfere with the right to parent children and devalue the parenting of certain people. So it's always been there, and yet that third component hasn't gotten as much attention as the other two. Now, part of the basis of the reproductive justice framework is a key foundational aspect of Black feminism, which I think is stated very well in the Combahee River Collective Statement of 1977. The importance of having an intersectional perspective on both interlocking systems of oppression. The Combahee River Collective Statement emphasizes racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression as interlocking systems of oppression, but I think also an approach that looks at how the policies and the practices are also intersectional, how those chief tenets of reproductive justice are intersectional. And again, I think the Dobbs decision really highlights how the human right to have children, not to have children, and to parent children are all equally important, and you can't focus on one without the other. The state oppression against them, the societal devaluation of them, all play off each other. And that's what I want to emphasize in my talk today. So the connection between abortion bans, punishment of pregnancy, and family separation has its roots in the institution of chattel slavery. Exploitation of enslaved women's reproductive labor entailed enslavers' domination of both childbearing and child rearing. So if we think about the violence inflicted on Black women by compelling their pregnancies under bondage, we can understand better, I think, the harm of compelled pregnancy, including the harm of compelled pregnancy through abortion bans. Because enslavers had a vital economic stake in Black women's childbearing, they made control of reproduction central to the slavery regime. It was an essential aspect of the legal apparatus that supported and perpetuated chattel slavery. Enslavers claimed a property right to enslaved women's bodies and to enslaved women's children from the moment of conception. Now, in 1662, the Virginia Colonial Assembly had to decide the status of children born to Black women but fathered by what in the preamble to the law says fathered by Englishmen, because in the colonial period there was no United States, and actually the concept of white people was just being developed as well, so they specified Englishmen. And these were mostly men who raped enslaved women with impunity, because enslaved women had no legal right to consent or not to consent to anything that enslavers wanted to do to them. And the colonists had to make this political decision about the status of these children. And you can imagine what was in their economic and political interest. It was to make these children have the status of their mothers so that they could be enslavable. And of course, today, most people think, well, of course, a black woman's children would be black. But that's not necessarily true. That's only because of the made-up rules about race. In fact, the very concept of race is made up, and those rules have always been made up by people in power to benefit them, and that's primarily white men. So I have usually included that law. I think I've included every book I've ever written, because I think it's such an important foundation of the reproductive violence that has continued in subsequent centuries, a foundation for the very meaning of race, foundation for some of the most virulent, oppressive stereotypes about black mothers. This permitted white men to profit from raping enslaved women by being able now to enslave their children. It allowed white men to enslave their own children by classifying them as belonging to another race. And race is so powerful. People think that race is biological. Actually, race is a political category that's more powerful than biology. It can erase biology. It erased the biological kinship between men like Thomas Jefferson, who enslaved his own children, who were he fathered as a result of raping Sally Hemings. And it also invented the myth that race is produced through reproduction, and so many people think you just inherit your race. And it also, I think, is the foundation of this idea that black women reproduce in their wombs the subordinated status of their children. In other words, it was a law that said black women reproduce enslavable children. And I think that idea that black women's wombs are dangerous for their own children innately, inevitably, is one of the most powerful stereotypes in the US, and of course this has traveled globally as well. So, although there are obvious distinctions between exploiting the reproductive labor of enslaved women and banning abortion, there's also a profound resemblance in the denial of autonomy caused by compelled pregnancy. Now, family separation was inextricably tied to this reproductive servitude I've just described. One of the most awful atrocities of the slavery regime was the physical separation of enslaved parents from their children. Enslavers had absolute discretion to buy and sell family members apart from each other, either at the auction block when families were put up for sale. Different enslavers could purchase different family members and break up the family then, or after they were installed, even if a whole family was purchased together, enslavers could pick off family members to sell for whatever reason they wanted to. It could be economic, to pay off a debt, just to make some more money, or it could be to punish enslaved families or to force them into compliance, a threat. We'll sell you away from your family if you don't comply, if you don't produce more of the crop, you don't pick more cotton, you don't work harder. Black people were devised in wills. They were wagered at horse races, awarded in lawsuits. Again, whatever reason. I think Toni Morrison said it so poignantly in her novel Beloved that enslaved women's loved ones routinely got rented out, loaned out, bought up, brought back, stored up, mortgaged, won, stolen, or seized. Nobody stopped playing checkers just because the pieces included your children. Now, even when enslaved families remained intact, Black parents were denied authority over their children. Slavery law installed the white patriarch as the head of the entire plantation family, and that included the people he enslaved. White people considered this plantation family headed by the white patriarch as the best institution to instill moral values on everybody, but especially in Black people, whom they thought were uncivilized and incapable of being moral. I mean, that's one of the main stereotypes of Black people, that we are innately incapable of moral, rational, and positive, decision-making. Also, they had unbridled authority to force Black children to work, to punish them. Parents couldn't interfere in the punishment of Black children for not working hard enough, and also to sexually assault children, which is also, I think, an aspect of the violence of slavery that doesn't get enough attention. Now, Black mothers resisted reproductive servitude in multiple ways. We know that they self-induced abortions. They fought back and tried to fend off enslavers' sexual assaults. You may know that pretty famous case of Celia, who was hanged for killing her enslaver, who purchased her as a teenager for the exclusive purpose of sexually assaulting her. And I think the main way that Black women fought back was to care for their children. And this created a cruel advantage that enslavers had, because they could threaten enslaved women who were rebellious or who were thinking of escaping with the sale of their children if they didn't stay put and if they didn't comply. Historians believe that one of the reasons that Black women were less likely to flee plantations than men is because of this hold that their children had on them, and that, of course, it was enslavers using their children, weaponizing their children as a way to keep them on the plantation. And we know that most fugitive women took their children with them if they could, but of course that made it harder to escape, to have children with you. Anyone who's cared for children knows that it makes it harder to do things, right? You gotta take care of those kids. So there's a long history of the white elite, on one hand, devaluing Black mothers' relationships with their children, pretending that they're meaningless, that this was one of the myths about Black families, that they would just get over the trauma of having their family separated within hours, maybe, because Black people don't have those kinds of loving relationships with each other. But then on the other hand, using the threat of child removal because of the loving bonds, right, to control and punish Black mothers. And I'll have more to say about that as well. Now, these rights of the family and the violation, I should say, of the rights of the family, of enslaved families, but a recognition of the universal human right of families was one of the chief arguments for ending slavery and for passing the 13th and 14th Amendments. Before the Civil War, during the anti-slavery abolition movement, one of the main appeals were images like the one up there of slave traders taking Black children away from their mothers, and mothers weeping, pleading to be kept with their children. And this was considered, some said, the greatest sin of slavery was family separation. And during the debates about the Reconstruction Amendments, in Congress, Black people came and testified about how horrible it was to have their bodies controlled by enslavers and have their families torn apart by enslavers. This was a major reason for the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments. And so when the Dobbs majority says there is no foundation in the US Constitution, especially specifically the 14th Amendment, for the right to abortion or reproductive freedom more broadly, it's absolutely historically wrong. It's just incredible that they could actually say that if they did any historical research at all. Obviously, it's just a political decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, but they are really bad originalists if they think that there is no basis for it when that was one of the compelling reasons, right, to pass the 14th and 13th Amendments. Okay. Now, after the Civil War, white Southerners argued that Black children needed to be supervised by white people because the Black race was not prepared for freedom. And they linked Black women's presumed sexual depravity, which was another myth that was circulated to justify the sexual assaults of Black women, the Jezebel idea that Black women were incapable of rape because we were always licentious and would never refuse sex. And so they linked that presumed sexual depravity to a presumed maternal deficiency. And I don't know if you can read the book, title page of that book, but that is the title page of The Plantation Negro as Freeman, published in 1889 by a renowned historian, Philip A. Bruce. And he argued in the book, along with all the reasons why Black people couldn't be self-determining people, they needed white supervision, but one of his arguments was that Black women needed supervision because they raised their daughters to follow their own depraved lifestyle, to, quote, teach them systematically, they were unable to, quote, teach them systematically those moral lessons that they peculiarly need as members of the female sex. And then, even after the civil rights movement, these ideas about Black mothers' unfitness, incapacity, but even the dangerous aspect of their mothering, that they teach their children to be immoral, to be violent, to be criminals, to be welfare cheats. That idea continued. And this idea that Black women passed down depravity to their children was embodied in images like the welfare queen. The idea that Black mothers had babies just to get a welfare check and did not care about their children. They didn't have children because they loved their children, wanted a loving relationship with their children. They had children to get a welfare check, and then because they did not care about their children, they would spend all the money on themselves. And we see that image circulating, especially during the Reagan administration, but continuing. So people just recognize, this look of the Black welfare queen and the kind of depraved mother that she is. And then also in social scientific research, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1965 report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, so claiming that Black mothers were overreaching matriarchs who drove Black men out of the home, and that was the reason for intense Black poverty in US cities, and it required some form of social policy to regulate Black mothers. So this idea that Black women's childbearing is a biological threat to their children, to their communities, to the nation. It's a social problem that requires punitive regulation of Black women. As you know, we can trace it back to texts like The Plantation Negro as a Freeman, and it has been very powerful in shaping public policy. One of the policies that it led to or supported was the mass sterilization of Black women during the 1960s and 70s under federal family planning programs or health care programs where Black women were threatened with being denied all sorts of health care or welfare benefits if they didn't sign consents, so-called consents to sterilization, or were just tricked into being sterilized or sterilized without their knowledge. So we know that forced sterilizations have continued in the United States. We don't know the extent of them because they have been committed against people who are incarcerated or detained, where it's very difficult for them to protest. But two cases are the forced sterilizations in California prisons, which were really a policy of the, part of the gender-sensitive policies of the California state prisons. And the head of that program, Dr. James Heinrich, boasted to a reporter that he had saved the state of California money by sterilizing these women, saving in welfare that would be paid for these unwanted children as they procreated more. And then there was the revelation by a Black nurse at a Georgia ICE detention facility that Black and brown women were being sterilized against their will in that facility as well. Another important and horrific policy that is grounded in this idea that Black women are innately unfit, that there's some kind of biological detriment that they pass on to their children, was and is the prosecutions of Black women. Now, these prosecutions have extended beyond Black mothers, but they began with the prosecutions of Black mothers or Black women who were pregnant and using drugs. And as I argued in my book, Killing the Black Body, this was punishing them for having babies. It had nothing to do with caring for the fetus or the children. It was all about punishing them for being pregnant and for having babies. This quote from an op-ed piece in the Houston Post, I think, really captures the idea that Black mothers have a biological defect that they pass on to their children. Call them welfare babies, crack babies, or deficit babies. By whatever term, they constitute a new bio-underclass of infants who are disadvantaged almost from the moment of conception. And this author was not talking about them being disadvantaged by racism. She was referring to them being disadvantaged by their mother's behavior. Now, over the ensuing decades, this began in the late 1980s and then continued into the early 1990s. The image of the crack, she mentions crack baby here. Of course, the crack babies were depicted as irredeemable monsters, and then it was claimed that Black mothers were chemically deprived of maternal instinct by the use of crack cocaine, ideas that had never applied to any other children or drug use during pregnancy. And this devaluation of their procreation turned the public health issue of drug use during pregnancy into a crime. So then, over the next decades, we see the fetal personhood movement developing a unified legal strategy to criminalize pregnancy outcomes. While they're shutting down abortion clinics, they're also working on criminalizing pregnancy outcomes, all under the same banner of protecting the fetus from the pregnant person's harm to them. And so the legal theories that were crafted initially to prosecute Black women in particular for being pregnant and smoking crack cocaine set the stage for more widespread criminalization of fetal harm. And by 2020, more than 1,700 women were arrested, detained, or subjected to forced medical intervention because of pregnancy-related accusations. And then we begin to see the prosecution of women for stillbirths and miscarriages. The first was the prosecution of Regina McKnight in South Carolina. She was convicted of homicide by child abuse for stillbirth, and she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. She spent 8 years in prison before her conviction was overturned. And it was overturned not because of the unconstitutionality or illegality or violation of human rights of punishing someone for having a stillbirth. Her conviction was overturned for ineffective assistance of counsel because her lawyer did not challenge adequately the state's experts, so-called expert witnesses, who claimed that they could show that it was her drug use that caused the stillbirth. Stillbirth could have been caused from a lot of reasons, and her lawyer didn't challenge it adequately. So she fortunately had her conviction thrown out after spending 8 years in prison, though, for the painful experience of having a stillbirth. And so now, by eliminating Roe's protection of abortion before viability, which some courts saw because of that contradiction. How can you punish someone for having a stillbirth if you couldn't punish them for having an abortion? And so some courts said, well, you can punish people for having an abortion after viability, so they put that limit on it. Now, that limit doesn't exist. There's no limit on punishing people for having an abortion. And so similarly, there's no limit on punishing people for having some outcome that the state doesn't like. You know, you might say that now the state has the power to criminalize pregnant people who fail to deliver a baby according to state standards. Because people have been punished for having healthy babies, but they engage in some unapproved conduct during pregnancy. I mean, think about how broad that power of the state to criminalize pregnancy is now. Certainly, that is an important aspect of reproductive justice, and it is, again, inextricably tied to the right to abortion. You know, so the right wing knew that. They were planning this unified strategy of punishing abortion or stillbirths or miscarriages or anything harmful to a fetus. And meanwhile, I think a lot of people in the reproductive rights movement were just focusing on abortion and not seeing the connection between the two. It's so connected. You know, a medical abortion looks like a miscarriage. And there's no reason to think they won't be, they already are criminalizing both, and that's only going to continue even more. Now, this idea that Black women's wombs are dangerous, I've been talking about how they've been used to punish Black women's childbearing. This same message has been used by anti-abortion groups to shame Black women who have abortions. And look at this billboard that was put up in Soho by an anti-abortion group. The most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. That's the same message that I've been talking about. That was the basis for all these punitive policies against Black women who had babies or wanted to have babies. The idea here is that Black women who have abortions are a danger to their children as well. And the claim is that Black women who have abortions are committing genocide against the Black community. Another aspect of reproductive violence against Black women that I think we must include is the high rates of maternal mortality in Black communities. The CDC very recently, just a few weeks ago, issued a report showing that the rate of maternal mortality in the United States rose sharply over the last couple years, which they attributed to the COVID pandemic. But I think it's important to note that the rate of maternal mortality in the United States has been going up for several years, even prior to COVID. The US has been an outlier among so-called Western nations or developed nations for a long time. It's always had the highest rates of maternal mortality, but for the rate to be going up, even most developing, so-called developing nations, the rate's going down, right? That's what you would expect. You're supposed to, nations are supposed to get healthier, especially wealthy nations. And the disparity between the rates of death of Black women and white women has consistently been terrible. Almost 3 to 4 times the rate. This article that came out in the New York Times recently about an epidural that was botched, the obstetrician botched it and killed this Black woman, despite her complaints that he was hurting her. He kept inserting the needle into her back in the wrong place, and it killed her. And the article points out that in New York City, Black women are 9 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. 9 times. So this is a problem that extends across the United States and is attributed to the dismissal of Black women's complaints and signs that something's wrong, but also to structural factors, to already being pregnant under unhealthy conditions, lack of access to high-quality prenatal care, health insurance, and that sort of thing. But I also want to point out that the worst places to have babies are the very states that are banning abortion. They have the worst health care, they have the highest maternal mortality rates, they also have the largest percent of Black people in those states, states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, the worst support for child care. They're just the worst place to be pregnant are the very places that are compelling people to be pregnant. Now, the Dobbs decision held out adoption as a solution to forcing people to give birth. Anti-abortion advocates have long held out adoption as the remedy to fix the harms caused by compelled pregnancies. They argue that the availability of adoption eliminates a pregnant person's obligation to raise unwanted children and therefore can be a substitute for having an abortion. You may recall that during the Dobbs argument, people stood out with signs like this: "We will adopt your baby," people who wanted Roe v. Wade to be overturned. And they've set up so-called pregnancy assistance clinics around the country that pressure pregnant people to continue with their pregnancies and tell them it's really easy to get their baby adopted, and that would be so much better. Although, most people who are unable to get an abortion have the baby and don't put the baby up for adoption. That's been clearly shown because of the great emotional toll it is to give up your baby once you have the baby, right? And this came up during the oral argument when Justice Amy Coney Barrett questioned the clinic's attorney, Julie Rickleman, and suggested that why don't people just put their babies in the safe haven drop-off spots, and isn't that the answer? And then Justice Alito, again, I don't know if you've read the opinion, read this opinion, it's horrific. But Justice Alito, in the opinion, picks up this idea, and he recites in the opinion, without any criticism at all, the argument that, quote, I'm reading from the opinion, states have increasingly adopted safe haven laws which generally allow women to drop off babies anonymously. A woman who puts her newborn up for adoption today has little reason to fear that the baby will not find a suitable home. Okay, that's a lie. That's just not true. That is not true. Okay, so, I suppose it depends on what you call a suitable home. But there are also many children, I'm going to get to this right now, in foster care who are never adopted or returned home. They age out of foster care. They're at high risk for houselessness, for low income or poverty, incarceration, terrible outcomes for them. They're just spit out of the system without support, sometimes after the state has taken benefits that they were entitled to, stolen it from them. They don't use those benefits for them. They put them in the state treasury to use for whatever they want to use it for. And children who were entitled to thousands and thousands of dollars of survivor benefits or disability benefits get kicked out of foster care with nothing. So that statement, it's just appalling that would be in a Supreme Court decision as if it's a matter of fact. Now, Alito goes on to back up this claim in a footnote that quotes a 2008 CDC report. Quote, nearly 1 million women were seeking to adopt in 2002, i.e., they were in demand for a child, whereas the domestic supply of infants relinquished at birth or within the first month of life and available to be adopted had become virtually non-existent. This is in the Supreme Court opinion. All right, so he's suggesting that forcing pregnant people to give birth creates a win-win situation. You surrender your baby for adoption, you go on with your life. Easy peasy, no burden of parenting, and then you're fulfilling the unmet need, the demand for adoptable children for all these people who haven't been able to find the babies that they want. So this vision of a well-functioning market for babies conveniently omits, first of all, just the physical and emotional toll of carrying a fetus to term, the emotional toll of giving up the baby. All of that is ignored in this opinion. But I want to talk about, in the few minutes, what do I have, like 10 minutes left maybe? Okay, few minutes I have left, about another aspect that the court completely ignores. I kind of alluded to it, jumping ahead a bit about aging out of foster care, and that is that the hardships that abortion bans impose on people who keep their babies create an avenue for family separation and coercive adoptions. It's much more likely that what will happen is not that people who have babies are going to just give up their babies at the, lines of people surrendering babies at safe havens. What's going to happen is they're going to keep the baby, and especially those who had decided they wanted an abortion because they weren't economically prepared to have another child, because they probably already have a child or two. They're going to now have harder economic struggles, and those are exactly the people that the child welfare system targets to take their babies away. So that's going to be the outcome of this case. Forced child removal, not voluntary surrender at safe haven laws. Okay, so I want to say something about this system that takes children away. I mentioned it earlier with those 3 cases at the very beginning. And I call this system a family policing system. And this is the subject of my latest book, Torn Apart. I know that probably most Americans think that the so-called child welfare system is some benevolent social service program that supports families and rescues children from severe abuse in the home. But in fact, it is a powerful state apparatus that gives people called mandated reporters, or just anyone, the power to report suspicions of child maltreatment, then investigates millions, 3 million families a year. I'm sorry, the families of 3 million children a year are investigated, and then it takes away at least 200,000 children a year from their families. They're more because it often presents, these caseworkers will present to the family what's called a safety plan. We won't go to court, but if you sign this safety plan that allows us to put your child in someone else's home, you can avoid going to court. And people are afraid. Sometimes they sign this because they're afraid if they go to court, they may lose their children forever. And so there's another, maybe just as many, maybe another 200,000 children. We don't know. There aren't good statistics kept on this that are also removed from their homes as a result of these investigations. So child protection agents, as I've just indicated, gain their power over families by wielding the threat of removing children from their homes and perhaps permanently severing the relationships between children and their family caregivers. In the year 2020, as I said, they investigated 3 million children. Now, some people think, oh, well, an investigation, isn't that good that they're looking into these accusations? Remember, anyone can call a child abuse hotline and make an accusation against somebody. And even mandated reporters are encouraged to report their suspicions of child maltreatment, just their suspicion. And then they think, oh, well, it'll be investigated. So what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is investigations are extremely traumatic experiences. Imagine a state agent coming into your home, usually without a warrant or any showing of probable cause. The Fourth Amendment applies to them, but they rarely do they go to court to get a warrant. And they come into your home, you know they have the power to take your children. You know, when Trump intensified the separation of children from their families at the southern border, the Mexican border, there was an outcry over it because people understand it is extremely traumatic for children and their loved ones to be separated. I can't even imagine how horrible that is, to take my child and put them somewhere. I don't know what's happening to them. And then there were briefs that were filed, reports that were filed by child welfare and child psychologists and international human rights experts, filed in federal court, put up on websites about how horrific this is, how traumatizing it is, how the long-lasting harms to children of separating them from their families. They called it genocide under international conventions. They called it torture under international conventions. And yet, more Black children are separated from their families than the rate of children separated at the border. This has been going on for decades. I mean, it's this intense kind of investigation and separation. Investigations not only have this threat, but then they search every corner of the house. They can strip search children looking for evidence, because when they come in your home, they're not just looking for evidence of the accusation. They're looking for any evidence they can find that, in their opinion, this could be someone, like you students in their 20s, going into a home and know nothing about this neighborhood or the struggles the family's going through, and make the decision to take children away. And then the family comes under, whether the children are taken away or not, if it's substantiated. Now, most of these accusations are not substantiated, but the family's gone through these terrible investigations. Then the family is now under what's called a service plan, and they have to fulfill or comply with a list of mandates that sometimes have nothing to do with the needs of the family. And if they don't comply, a judge can terminate their parental rights. Most of terminations of parental rights aren't because of a determination that the child will be unsafe if they're returned home. It's because of a determination that the family did not comply with the service plan in a sufficient time. Okay, a recent study found that half of Black children in America will undergo one of these child welfare investigations by the time they reach age 18. Half of Black children. Just an astounding amount of state intervention into Black families and communities. The roots of family policing are in the apprenticeship system after the Civil War, when tens of thousands of Black children were returned to former enslavers by judges on grounds that their families were neglectful. So similar to what happens in the family policing system today, and the use of child removal as a literal weapon of war against Native tribes during the Indian Wars. That then morphed into a formal federal adoption policy of finding Native families neglectful and putting their children into white orphanages or getting them adopted by white families. And the main reason families are investigated and children are removed from their homes is for what's called neglect. Less than 20% of children in foster care are there for physical or sexual abuse. Most are there for neglect. Neglect is basically defined as poverty. It's the failure to meet children's needs. And so being unhoused or having insecure housing, inadequate clothing, inadequate food, inadequate education, inadequate health care, all can be grounds for finding of parental neglect. There is rampant racism in this system, both structurally, as I've been saying, that this is a system that targets Black communities, but also racial bias, anti-Black racial bias in decision-making that's well documented. And I'm highlighting here doctors because it's been so well documented. It's almost easier to document because you can look at the injuries to children and see how doctors treat them, and the exact same injuries are much more likely to be suspected as child abuse if the family is Black than if the family is white. And also, one of the main areas where doctors report child neglect or abuse is for fetal neglect. It's parents pregnant mothers mostly who test positive for drugs, or newborns who test positive for drugs, and we have absolute, undeniable evidence that they are far more likely to suspect drug use, test for it, and report it in the case of Black mothers, especially impoverished Black mothers. There is no universal rule on this. hospitals do whatever they want on this, and even though they will say we're mandated to report it, they do not report it in private hospitals with wealthy patients. So it's so rife with abuse. We also have to see this as part of a carceral web where the family policing system is deeply entangled with police and prisons. And I say they're part of one, system. We have to include family policing in the prison industrial complex. They work with police officers. They bring police officers along, as I mentioned in the cases. Police were involved in every one of those cases to bring in armed force to invade homes and take children away. And police have more power to get into homes because the caseworkers don't abide by the Constitution. Not that police always do either, but at least they're expected to. Caseworkers aren't even expected to. And then on the other hand, the caseworkers have more power than police because they've got this claim we're going in to help, and judges give them a pass because they're supposed to be benevolent and not punitive, when, as I've said, they're extremely punitive. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit quicker. There's also the carceral logic underlying family policing. The same logic of police and prisons, which is the way to meet human needs is to punish people who have those needs, unmet needs. And that's what prisons do, that's what police do, and that's what family police do. Because the ideology of the system is that child maltreatment or the unmet needs of children are the result of parental pathologies. And the way to fix that is to cure the parents with this long list of what they have to, these mandates, especially parent training classes and psychiatric counseling and that sort of thing. So therapeutic cures, which diverts our attention from what really are the main harms to children and the causes of children's unmet needs. They actually don't meet the needs of children, and they don't attend to the vast majority of impoverished children in America. They don't do anything for them, but the ones that they do target, they don't provide the resources that they need. They pretend, oh, it's the parents, they're uncaring parents, they're unfit parents, we gotta fix them. And so it is a major way that this nation ignores, excuses, obscures the need for radical social change and puts it on the backs of these families that are terribly, terribly traumatized, and whole communities that are disrupted by this. I should probably, okay, I'm gonna go. You can, if there's time for Q&A, you can ask me about the Adoption and Safe Families Act and welfare restructuring, but believe me, the laws around the end of welfare and the laws surrounding the prioritization of adoption in child welfare policy are deeply entangled and were passed a year apart, and just another example of how we cannot separate these aspects of reproductive violence and reproductive justice. All right, I'm going to conclude with this. We have been seeing in the United States and actually around the world, I've been in touch with people in Europe, Australia, in Aboriginal people in Australia, they're fighting this battle. Immigrants in Sweden, in the UK, Black people in the UK who are fighting this battle, in other parts of the world, where there is a growing movement to abolish the family policing system. Many of us have come to the conclusion it cannot be fixed. It's founded on oppressive logics. It's deeply entangled, as I said, with police and prisons, and it harms. It harms families. It harms children. It does not keep children safe. It endangers children. And as I said, it obscures what we really need to do to improve the welfare and safety of children in America and support families. And so, abolitionist organizing is dismantling piece by piece this system while we are reimagining what does it take to actually help children in our society to thrive, to actually have a supportive, caring, humane approach to child welfare, to actually keep people safe in their homes. And so we've been doing legislative efforts, rallies, but also building up mutual aid networks to provide actual supports for families, working on transformative justice that attends to intimate partner violence and violence against children in homes, but in a way that gets to the root of it, that actually works to prevent the violence, doesn't just swoop in and take children after it's too late. And as you probably know, reading these stories, that so often when children are killed in the home, which is rare, it's children who are known to the system. The system didn't even work to prevent the harm to the children they knew about. And so in conclusion, I think that this shows us, and again, Dobbs accentuates it, but these entanglements have always been there since the time of chattel slavery and throughout the last 100 years. It shows us the way in which these foundational oppressions are interlocking, but also how the violence against people who don't want to have children, who are compelled to give birth, the violence of keeping people or punishing people for giving birth, and the violence of family separation are all interlocking, and that our movements against each of these are also interlocking, should be interlocking. And so my hope, despite the really frustration of seeing so much that I worked on in the late 1980s, now worse than it was then. My hope is that as we see all of reproductive justice, as we see our collective and common vision for a society that truly meets human needs without caging people, without arresting people, without taking children away, as we imagine and work toward that, we can actually build a world that is truly caring and humane and equitable. And so I call on all of you to support all of reproductive justice. There's so many ways that we can do that. And I hope I've left time for a few questions and answers. And thanks so much for your attention. Thank you. Okay. Sure.
Please feel free. We have time for some questions. Raise
good.
Yeah,
okay. Are they going to go there? Okay, yes. Then I can keep track that way. Okay, cool. All right. Well, if people stand, I can see who's.
Perfect.
Yeah, that'll work. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much. I use your work in all of my classes, all of them, and I rely on your work so much.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
What do you teach?
I teach both feminist studies and legal studies, and
okay.
I teach classes in slavery, contemporary slavery, sexual violence, sexual trafficking, human trafficking, etc.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can see how it is helpful. And I also have to teach future healthcare workers and social workers.
Yes.
And the healthcare workers understand what's going on, especially with rising mortality and so on. But it's very difficult to teach future social workers or family police, as we might say.
Right.
And to try to get them to do a different job.
Yes.
But if you're someone who focuses on intersectionality and someone who focuses on how women are punished by the system, it's very difficult to talk about the construction of childhood and of the agency of children
Yeah.
and the rights of children.
Yeah.
Especially if you're dealing with criminal trafficking or something. It's difficult. And so the question of how do you teach about the rights of children without being cynical, especially right now. And also I was wondering about this idea of the abolition of the family that's very popular in social reproduction theory. And yet I want to be able to teach that, and at the same time, I find it very difficult.
Yeah.
And
oh, boy, you just asked all the tough questions, about 10 of them in one question. Yeah, well, I deeply appreciate those questions. And, they're the questions that I've been grappling with, along with other people I'm working with who teach, including people who teach in social work schools. So first of all, I would say that it's important to recognize, and I try to emphasize this throughout my talk, especially talking about family policing, that children's rights are not protected or even acknowledged by this system. They harm children. They don't care the trauma children are going through when they're taken from their loved ones. If children say, I want to stay home, they're going to ignore that. So it's not, this system doesn't at all protect the interests of children. In fact, mentioning sex trafficking, that's part of the problem of the harms to children who run away from foster care. Every jurisdiction, some worse than others, have this issue of children running away from foster care. And if they've been disconnected from their families, or they know they can't go back to their families because that's the first place they're going to look for them, many of them are living in the street, and they are extremely vulnerable to sex trafficking. In my book, I have a whole section on that with lots of sources that show that connection. Group homes, people who want to sex traffic children know that foster care group homes are the perfect place to, and I give examples where they've found this to be going on. Also, I skipped over this slide about criminalizing Black children. Being in foster care, if you're a Black teenager, it increases dramatically the odds that you are going to be put in juvenile detention because conflicts that you get into in group homes or even in an individual foster home are much more likely to be sent to the police. And that's what happens to a lot of the children who run away. What do? They send the police after them, and they get punished for it. These two young men here are both boys who were killed in so-called residential treatment facilities, which are like prisons. And Black teenagers are very likely, also LGBTQ children, very likely to be put in these places that are supposed to be for children with behavioral problems, but if they can't find another place to put them, that's where they put them. And the guards, they'll call them staff, but they're basically guards, have been violent against these children, and just two recent cases where children were asphyxiated by guards for minor infractions. Cornelius Fredericks threw a piece of bread in the cafeteria. And David Hess, they were searching his room to look for a missing iPad. So, the idea that this system has anything to do with protecting children, and overall, as I said, the harms to children, if we want to talk about children's rights, we should be talking about their right to an equal education, their right to equal health care, their right to housing, right? Their right to income for their family. You know, that's what we should, and this system has nothing to do with that. It distracts us from those and just focuses in on supposedly pathological parents. So that's how I would address that. And then the family. I mean, I take that, the critique of the family, but the family policing system is all about enforcing dominant family norms. So that, you know, even if you think we want to get to a place where we abolish the family, or the family as we know it, however you want to say it, right? We're only going to get there if we abolish the family policing system, because the family policing system punishes people who are in non-conforming families. And a perfect example of that is Governor Abbott in Texas, who has issued an order for Child Protective Services to investigate families with trans children. Now, the idea is, well, they're committing child abuse because they're allowing gender-affirming care. So first of all, you know, this idea that gender-affirming care is child abuse, that's a problem by itself. But the caseworkers aren't just going after, you know, families with trans children who have gotten a surgery or something, or hormone treatment or something like that. You know, it's, again, they act on suspicions or anonymous calls. So this is just an invitation to descend on families with trans children, to punish them and to frighten them. Already families have moved out of the state because they're afraid. So that's just one example. But even if we look at Black mothers, the part of the disparagement of Black mothers is that they're unmarried and that they're not raising their children in nuclear families. And that's why they're unfit. That's the whole point of the you know, Daniel Patrick Moynihan and many others. So, and they're too rebellious. This is the other thing about this system. You get punished if you're rebellious. If you care too much for your children, you get punished. If you want to care for your children in another way, like the family I talked about at the beginning who wanted a midwife, they wanted a home birth, they wanted the midwife to care for them, they're punished for it. And I can give you so many examples. This is what the system does. It punishes people for not conforming to state standards. And so we have to address it. I actually don't think there is any contradiction between a critique of the family and a critique of family policing. That's what, you know, family policing and critiquing the norms of family. Now, we could get into, I mean, and I know there was someone else once asked a question, and this would be a longer, I mean, obviously, this is a big, long conversation, but, you know, the very notion of family, is there something wrong with any kind of support for families because the notion of family is oppressive by itself? And I just would say to that the people I am working with and for, they love their family members. They want they want to be with their families. They see value in their families. And okay, let me just add one other thing. And they also want to work with people who are opposing the family policing system, which, and I'm getting to the first part of your question, which can include social workers. They do not, the ones I work with, do not want to work with social workers who work for the state in a capacity of Child Protective Services. And so I encourage students law students as well as social work students, but also doctors. As I point, doctors are chief reporters to CPS. So in all of these professions, we have to contest the way in which the system turns those people into agents of the state. These are people who are trained to support other people, to care for them. Doctors, nurses, social workers, lawyers who should be representing the families. And there are ways that you can do that. That's a wonderful, they're family defense units in many legal services offices where the lawyers are dedicated to representing families. And part of why we say families is because that includes the children. It's not parents' rights. That's something else. Okay, this is family defense and family justice. And there are ways you can work for that, for abolition, instead of working to punish people. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm feeling slightly guilty because I'm sort of want to steer it in a slightly different direction.
Okay, no, sure.
So I'm sort of wondering about, I guess, feminist scholarship and transnational feminist solidarity. And I'm saying that because, I recently organized an event on reproductive justice in the Middle East, and there were people speaking about the Sudan and Lebanon and Tunisia. And what was very evident in these talks, and which is so evident listening to you, is that, we really moved away from sort of past where, gender or sexuality, intersectionality was some kind of marginal lens. It's so clear, it was clear listening to my colleagues in the Middle East, but listening to you is that actually an angle of reproductive justice, not only does it have to be holistic and intersectional, but actually it tells us everything we need to know about the kind of political system and society we live in.
Yes.
Everything is there, right? And I'm wondering, is it time for us, I'm sort of assuming us in terms of, feminist scholars and activists working in the US globally, to be more confident in making that point, right? Because I feel like in the Middle East, following the so-called Arab Spring, there was really a shift in terms of a recognition that there is no way that we can challenge authoritarianism and militarism and sectarianism without centering gender and sexuality intersectionally, of course.
Yes.
But I feel maybe in the US, almost, feminist scholars were kind of don't have that sort of confidence. There's an obvious reason for that because there's so much pushback and backlash.
Yeah.
But I think that there might be, on that specific issue, I think this is really a moment to make those connections. Of course, there's things that are so specific to the history of this country, but there are so many things that are also universal, and their connections and parallels.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, you said that you had some connections with people elsewhere.
Yes. So not the Middle East, but mostly places where Black, brown, and indigenous peoples' families have been separated and are being separated by the state. And those are European nations and Australia are the main ones I've been in connection with, which shows how even in Western nations, European nations that have a strong welfare state, family policing can still be an oppressive arm of the state. And I think that shows why we have to have an intersectional lens. And as I tried to say in my talk, I'm not just talking about the intersection of identities. It's also the intersection of systems of oppression, as the Combahee River Collector said, but also the intersection of these policies and practices and systems, the systems of the state, and the intersection of the ideologies that support them, that's so important to bring to the forefront. I agree with you. I don't think we can understand the crisis we're in without seeing those intersections. And also, and this is kind of the point I was making about Dobbs, that when we have these, these really severe violations of reproductive freedom, we see how it reverberates throughout society to harm so many people, not just the people seeking abortions. I was just thinking yesterday, because I read yet another proposed bill, or a story about a proposed bill that is criminalizing people who help someone to get an abortion. A lawsuit by an ex-husband who's spying on his wife, reading her text messages, sees that she's texting with these other women, and is suing her friends for helping her to get, every part of that is just vile, it's just, can you imagine, it's just so disgusting, but the Texas law that allows people to bring lawsuits against anyone helping someone to get an abortion. So all of these laws that are that just expand the police state, enlist us to spy on each other, sue each other, and then punish people who help. It's beyond abortion. It's the character of our society. So either way you look at it, do you know what I mean? Whether you're looking at a clear violation of reproductive justice and then seeing how that affects so many other aspects of society, or whether you are thinking about some other violation, then you realize, oh my goodness, that's connected to reproductive justice as well. But of course, that if we're going to say that this shows the importance of feminism, feminist analysis, then we want to have a feminist analysis that's deeply intersectional. It would be wrong to have a feminist analysis that doesn't do that. That's not going to help. And in fact, it leads to people misunderstanding the potential of feminism and being turned away from it. And those feminists who have the public's ear, or have the media's ear, or have resources, can then dominate, and then the intersectional ones don't have what they need to actually lead a movement. But I'm with you, as you can see. That's why so much of my work comes back down to, I keep coming back and back and back to reproductive justice. No matter what topic I'm writing about, I have found it's so important to to these fundamental aspects of our humanity and how we're valued in society. Again, whether we're having babies or not having babies, capable of having babies or not capable, that's not the point. It's the policies and ideas around it that are so powerful. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Professor Roberts, is this on? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
oh, good. Now you can hear me.
You have to speak right into it. I'm
okay. Yeah, very close. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Latham Thomas. I'm a visiting professor of the practice of gender studies here in Pembroke Center. And I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on how Black women are seen as unfit to take care of their own children, but seen as overqualified to take care of the children of others.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And so when we think about domestic work and how we're overrepresented, how we are inside of spaces where our parenting is policed and surveilled, and yet we set a standard for how child caring and child rearing is happening across this country. And so I wondered if you could speak to the dichotomy and how we develop cultural norms, but also a framework really that continues to over-police how we parent, but also at the same time demand of our labor in caretaking.
Yes. That's one of the contradictions that racism is able to perpetuate. Racism is so deep in the way in which it can assert claims that are absolutely opposite. Absolutely opposite, and yet that ideology, for some people, makes them conform to each other. Just the idea, for example, that Black people's bodies are so different from other human beings' bodies that our organs are different, our brains are different, our hearts are different. You couldn't possibly transplant a Black person's organ into a white, of course that's not true, but these ideas were so different, and yet our bodies have been used for experimentation to produce benefits, medical benefits for everybody, especially white people. Major contradiction. Black people are lazy, and yet we're the ones who were forced to work to build the nation. Just so many contradictions. As I said in my lecture, the idea that Black mothers don't care about their children, well, if we didn't care about our children, it wouldn't hurt us to take our children away. It wouldn't do anything. There wouldn't be a point of control. And yet it's exactly because we care so much about our children that they can mandate all these tasks, and Black mothers feel forced to do these tasks to get their children back. I have never seen the fierceness of anyone like the Black mothers I've worked with whose children were taken, who would do anything, their whole lives, their mission is to get their children back. And they will try to comply under the most grueling circumstances to do what the state tells them to do, and then still organize, still protest in this bind now. This is going to make it harder for me to get my children back. Again, this contradiction. And you're stating yet another one, that we are unfit to take care of our children, but we can take care of white people's children. But the caveat, though, the condition is under the supervision of white people. So we're the idea that a Black woman would adopt a white child, very rare. And some people think that's, oh no, that the state would never let that happen. How could that happen? I mean, the idea that a white woman would adopt a Black child, that's seen as positive by many people, and that there should be no barriers to that. But the idea that a Black woman would have full authority over a white child, that image doesn't exist in dominant U.S. culture. And so, but what does that mean? She could be the nanny to the white child. She could provide all the care for the white child, but she doesn't truly have authority over that child. She has to be supervised. And so that's the condition on which the Black mammy stereotype was created. She is supposed to be completely devoted, a total servant to white people. And what happens to her children? Who cares? Plus, there's this idea that she's innately negligent toward her own children. That's, as you're asking this question, that's almost part of the biological argument, is that she passes on the depravity to her own children biologically, but she, under the supervision of the white mistress, she can raise the white children. You see what I'm saying? I mean, that's another layer. I actually hadn't thought about this before, to tell you the truth, of the nature of the biological argument. What it gives you. It gives you, I said three things it gives you earlier, that and this idea that Black women naturally pass on the depraved lifestyle and harms to their children. But that also means that then they can be used non-biologically to supervise and raise white children as long as they're under the supervision of white people. And certainly this idea that black parents need to be supervised by white people is a foundational idea underlying family policing, and that they would be better off, though, in the care of anyone else, which is part of the reason why studies have shown, and I've seen this play out, that it's much easier for caseworkers to remove black children and white children from the home for the same allegations. And I've just seen it in cases, in court hearings, in meetings, in symposia, in scholarly articles. The failure to even acknowledge at all, any recognition of the harm to children of taking them from their families. It's so often, it's not even part of the equation. It's how long should we keep the children in foster care? It's not, what was the harm of putting them there in the first place? So yeah, thanks for that question.
I don't know if I'm tall enough for this. Hi, thank you so much. This was amazing. I'm actually in a class right now called Reproductive Injustice, and Professor Thomas is one of the professors for the class. So we've been talking a lot throughout the course about the history of various forms of contraception, as you mentioned, like the way it's been tested on black bodies, not just black bodies, Latinx bodies, the history of forced sterilization on indigenous people, black people. But then more recently, we've been talking about abortion and contraception, and like the slide you showed with the billboard that kind of like proposes this false genocide and like the propaganda about this genocide against black communities. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do you balance having like honest conversations about the very real history of like forced contraception onto certain communities without slipping into race-based attacks on contraception and abortion that are unfounded?
Oh, okay. Well, part of it is knowing the history. Clarence Thomas didn't know the history when he said that the 14th Amendment doesn't protect reproductive freedom. And he also doesn't know the history when he says abortion has been an instrument of genocide and eugenics in particular. Eugenicists didn't advocate for abortion. Margaret Sanger didn't even like abortion, and they used sterilization was their instrument, not abortion. And there's a difference between forcing someone to be sterilized or coercing them into it and their decision to do it without coercion. And of course, we want to create the conditions where people aren't forced to do any kind of reproductive act that they don't want to. And so, he's just completely wrong in the history. It's compelled pregnancy that is closer to enslaving people, and forced sterilization that is what eugenicists used, and access to abortion increases people's liberty and freedom. So, so knowing the history, I think, helps. Understanding that during the eugenics era, for example, there were members of the black community who wanted expanded reproductive health care, including contraception and birth control, but not forced on them. I would say it's I don't want to dismiss the complexities of this, but it is pretty simple to understand the difference, right, between being forced to use any technology, or forced to have a baby, or forced to do some kind of reproductive act, versus freely deciding that is what's best for you. Now, it is more complicated because, of course, any decision we make is in a context of social, ideological, political, economic constraints and conditions. And so I don't want to make it seem as if on the one hand is, state policies that strap you down and force you to do something versus a free decision we make otherwise. It is more complicated than that, but there's a clear ethical, difference between coercing someone to do something and giving them access to something. That, again, a clear difference. It is complicated. I don't think that just providing access to something is necessarily an ethical thing to do, because what you're giving them access to may be harmful. You know what I mean? So it is more complicated, but I think we can make that distinction, and I do think that careful attention to the history is one way to do that. Sure. Thank you. Oh, my goodness. Thank you. This is